Welcome to our Thursday conference keynote presentation. Thank you all for being here on time. As the week progresses, it becomes more challenging to be here at the earlier hours. So I see a few bleary-eyed people, but we know that this keynote presentation will wake us all up because this is very important. I'd like, as has happened at each previous keynote lecture, to acknowledge the Jajarong people as the original people of the land. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I come from, we do the same thing. We acknowledge the significance of the tangata whenua, the people of the land, the Māori people of Aotearoa. So a welcome to you in the Māori language this morning. Kia ora tātou, haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Haere mai ki tēnei hui, haere mai ki te ako, he painga mō mātou katoa. A warm welcome to you all. May this be a time of blessing and of learning for us all. Salam alaikum, peace be with you. Shalom, namaste, nau mai, haere mai. A warm welcome to everyone. And a special welcome this morning to our keynote speaker, Professor Prof Saeed and Mrs. Saeed. A warm welcome to you both. Thank you for coming through potentially stormy weather all the way from Melbourne. But we're pleased that the weather improved yesterday for you to be able to come rather than on the train. I was first privileged to meet Professor Saeed when he came to Otago University in Dunedin, where I work as a chaplain back in 2007, to deliver our annual chaplaincy and Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group Peace Lecture. And we began these annual peace lectures in 2004. Professor Saeed is currently the Sultan of Oman, Professor of Arab and Islamic Studies and Director of the National Centre of Excellence for Islamic Studies at the University of Melbourne. He is also a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Among his publications are Reading the Quran in the 21st Century, Islam and Human Rights, Islamic Political Thought and Governance, the Quran, an Introduction, Interpreting the Quran Towards a Contemporary Approach, Islamic Banking and Interest, Islam in Australia, Freedom of Religion, Apostasy and Islam. Professor Saeed works closely with many national and international organisations and contributes to their projects relating to Islam and Islamic thought. He is currently a member of the UNESCO Commission of Australia of the Department of Foreign Affairs of Australia. He contributes to print and electronic media on Islamic issues. He has a wide range of professional and research relationships around the world and is on the editorial board of several international refereed journals. He is also well known for his interfaith activities in Australia and overseas. He was awarded the Order of Australia in 2013. Following morning tea this morning, Professor Saeed will be presenting one of the workshops in Lecture Theatre 251, which you are welcome to consider going to as one of the options where we will follow through on the material presented in this keynote address. And at the end of this lecture there will be 10 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'd invite Professor Saeed please to present his keynote address, Islam and the Religious Other, towards a more inclusivist view. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to you all. Thank you, Greg, for your very generous and kind introduction. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to come and give this keynote address. Ladies and gentlemen, we from different religious traditions are living at a time that demands from us new ideas about understanding each other and living with each other in harmony and mutual respect. This is despite the significant differences that all of us have in our religious traditions as far as the religious other is concerned. All of us have very deeply held and very strong views sometimes about other religious traditions and the religious other. So I thought in this talk I will focus on the issue of how we, from different religious traditions, should see the religious other, at least from a Muslim perspective. My focus will be very much on Islam and the Muslim perspective. My interest is in making a small contribution to this discourse. My focus is on how Muslims should see the religious other in the current political, social, economic, intellectual, and cultural contexts in which we are all functioning today. Although we can talk about the religious other as an intra-Muslim other or an inter-religious other, my primary interest is in the religious other from a different religious tradition. My talk is more about how we should see the religious other as a person, not so much about whether the religious tradition the person belongs to is valid or invalid or corrupted or not corrupted, authentic or inauthentic, or even whether salvation is possible through that religious tradition. I'm not interested in that side of the story. Religious traditions like Islam have developed a range of ideas about these matters in relation to other religious traditions. And changing those ideas and positions can be very difficult, if not impossible, at least in the short to medium term. But I believe that the way we look at the religious other as a person can be modified, changed, or revised a bit more easily. And in fact, we should do so based on the current context in which we are living right now. In the talk, I will briefly make reference to a number of Muslim views on the issue of religious other in the past as well as in the present, and will explore how some Muslim thinkers and theologians are exploring this issue today. Let me make a couple of observations first. I believe that religious traditions like Islam, or for that matter, Christianity, and other religious traditions have always been able to adapt to change. For me, positions that religious traditions like Islam have developed in relation to the religious other were developed in a particular social, political, economic, intellectual, and cultural context. In the case of Islam, the positions Muslim theologians developed in relation to the religious other in the very early period of Islam, that is, from the 7th to the 9th centuries of the Common Era, or the first 3 centuries of Islam, occurred in a very specific context. The key aspects of this context, very briefly, could be summarized as follows. First, the very visible political, military, and economic dominance of Islam as a religion, and of Muslims over people of other faiths in Muslim-dominated regions of what we call Middle East and North Africa. Second, a strong sense of superiority of Islam among Muslims over other religions at that time. Third, a powerful Muslim state that provided the necessary backing for all of this. context in which Muslim theologians developed a whole range of ideas about the religious other. The position I take is this: if such theological positions were heavily influenced by the context of the time, then when that context significantly changes, there is also the possibility of changing those positions further down the track. This, in fact, I believe, is what we are seeing today among many Muslim theologians and scholars who are trying to rethink some of those early positions in relation to the religious other. For me, this issue of context and these ideas is very important. And in my own writings, I always argue for rethinking positions that develop within the religious tradition in particular context. The context in which we are living in right now is quite different. Let me also make a few comments regarding terminology. I'll be using two key terms in this talk: exclusivism and inclusivism. But I will also use labels hard and soft with each of them. For me, the positions that I'm talking about can be placed on a continuum from hard inclusivism to hard exclusivism. I'm not using the term pluralism in this context for obvious reasons. Let's not worry too much about that. In order to show that I'm interested in the religious other as a person, let me also show how these four different labels I'm using, that is hard inclusivism, soft inclusivism, soft exclusivism, and hard exclusivism, how these four labels can be used with certain metaphors that I use in some of my own writings. The metaphors are brother, sister, neighbor, stranger, and enemy. Four different attitudes that many of us, at least in the Islamic tradition, we developed in relation to the religious other, and I'm sure some other religious traditions are also familiar with that kind of metaphors. Now let us look at the early context of the development of Muslim views on the religious other, going back to the past. During the first 3 centuries of Islam, that is, from the 7th to the 9th centuries of the Common Era, this is the time when Islamic tradition was in its early phase of development, Muslim theologians developed a range of views about the religious other. And as I indicated, these views range from hard inclusivist to hard exclusivist. The positions that Muslim theologians developed in this early period were rooted in the texts of the Quran, which is the holy scripture of Muslims, and Prophet Muhammad's practice, but were also closely connected to the social, political, intellectual, military, and cultural context of the time. So for me, this is not an issue of just looking at the scripture and working out these ideas. It is the scripture, the sacred texts, in the context that Muslims try to understand and develop ideas, and that's something I'm trying to emphasize throughout the talk. It is important to know that the texts of the Muslim Holy Scripture, that is the Quran, on the religious other, are by no means uniform, or some would say perhaps even consistent. Some Quranic texts appear to have adopted a very positive view of the religious other, while some other texts appear to be very negative. Some religious traditions and beliefs are heavily criticized in the Quran, while others are treated very positively. This, of course, makes it difficult for a Muslim to say whether the Muslim Holy Scripture, the Quran, was either exclusivist or inclusivist. All these texts required interpretation in the context of early Islam. This interpretation actually resulted in a range of different positions in relation to the religious other. There is a whole body of literature on this in Islamic theology and law, and we do not have time to go into those details. Let me just give a couple of examples from the Quran. The Quran praises, for example, Christians in this verse. You, meaning Muhammad, will find the nearest of them, meaning people, in affection to the believers, as Muslims, are those who say, we are Christians. That is because among them are priests and monks, and because they are not arrogant. Chapter 5, verse 82. At the same time, it criticizes certain Christian beliefs, in particular about the nature of Jesus Christ. At times, the Quran criticizes certain people of Jewish faith, and at other times, it praises other people of Jewish faith. At times, the Quran seems to be suggesting that salvation is possible via a number of channels, as long as the basic elements of belief in God, doing good works, and belief in final judgment are upheld. At other times, it seems to be suggesting that in order to achieve salvation, one has to follow Islam. Naturally, there are different ways of understanding such texts. So there is in the scripture a variety of texts that could be helpful to develop positions in relation to the religious other, either from an inclusivist perspective or from an exclusivist perspective. Where the emphasis should be depends very much on the context in which the interpreters are functioning or were functioning. That context perhaps pushed early Muslim theologians to develop somewhat exclusivist views of the religious other, in a sense marginalizing many inclusivist texts. For example, despite the reverence and respect shown by the Quran throughout the Quran actually, towards the scriptures of Jews and Christians, Muslim theologians developed the theory of distortion of Jewish and Christian scriptures. Another example is the idea of dhimmi in Islamic tradition. A dhimmi is an Arabic word, which really means a follower of another religious tradition, particularly Christian or Jewish, living in a Muslim state who is protected by the Muslim state. Even though this concept of dhimmi does not necessarily have to have any significant negative connotations associated with that, in early Islam, by and large, Islamic tradition developed some ideas about the dhimmi which could be considered very negative. Based on those negative ideas, a variety of discriminatory practices and restrictions on the religious other were developed in early Islam. One could argue that these positions that were developed by Muslim theologians in a particular context remained relevant as long as the context also remained very similar, subsequent contexts. So what was this context of early Islam like, in which all these developments were taking place? Let me highlight a few points about this context. Muslim states at the time were very heavily dominated, most states at the time were dominated by a particular religious group. And the superiority of this group, politically, socially, and theologically, was taken for granted. That was the case in most societies at the time. There was no concept of equal citizenship. This is a very modern concept, obviously. In most states, the dominant religious group set down the rules that governed the other religious minorities, who were often subservient to the dominant group. Those who belonged to minority groups were often kept physically separate from the majority, even confined to particular areas of the town or city. Religious minorities at times had some degree of religious freedom, but this was often severely restricted. The concept of human dignity that developed in the modern period, and we are so used to now, did not exist at the time in the way we understand it today. So religious traditions often found convenient that when needed to develop ideas or justifications to dehumanize those who did not belong to the dominant religious tradition. Not always, but in many cases that happened. The kind of thinking about religion or the religious other that I've just talked about could not just be found in Islamic history. By and large, many religious traditions functioned in this way. And for them, it was quite reasonable to think like this. In this context, it was relatively easy to develop strongly exclusivist ideas about the religious other. Islam and Christianity, for example, both developed very similar exclusivist ideas in that context. In order to show that this is not a specifically Islamic problem, may I take you from the 7th to the 9th centuries of the Common Era to the 12th to the 14th centuries of the Common Era, in a place where the context I have just referred to dominated. In this case, the context of Christians in some parts of Spain and the context of Muslims in other parts of Spain during the same period. At the time, we find that Christians and Muslims in general viewed each other in very similar terms. The images that we have from historical sources and the text that we have from legal documents and the literature show that both Christians and Muslims saw each other exactly in the same way. From a Christian point of view, for example, Islam was a distorted religion. Muslims were seen as uncivilized, evil, and depraved. Sexual relations, for example, between Muslims and Christians were prohibited. Christians were encouraged not to mix with Muslims because mixing could be detrimental to Christian identity. And where Christians were dominant, Muslims' freedom to practice their religion was severely curtailed. From a Muslim point of view, Christianity and Christians were exactly seen in the same way. So the issue is context. In the same context, two different religious traditions developed very similar ideas and applied them, or tried to apply them at least. But even though these attitudes and views were dominant, how these attitudes and views were put into practice by the relevant state authorities in Spain varied enormously, from society to society, from time to time. Much depended, of course, on the political and economic context of the time. When political and economic insecurity prevailed within the society, the dominant group often resorted to more strongly exclusivist positions, restrictions, and measures. But in times of stability and prosperity, the dominant group was less exclusivist towards the other. So we could argue that in the early and pre-modern contexts, exclusivist views of the religious other made sense for religious traditions in general, such as Islam and Christianity. The overall frameworks that were available to think about the religious other simply could not have provided the basis for considering the religious other as a brother or a neighbor, and an ethical treatment that corresponded to such a view. This is in general, but of course religious traditions developed these ideas, but we're talking about the dominant patterns here. Now let's look at the modern period, the context in which we are functioning today. This context is quite different to the context of the early or pre-modern periods, philosophically, politically, intellectually, and culturally. Today, most of us, regardless of our religious identity, uphold many ideas, including the ideas of equality, equal citizenship, human dignity, in the way we understand it today, respect for other religious traditions, religious freedom, and the neutrality of the state in matters of religion, at least in countries like Australia. This is a radical departure from the early and pre-modern understandings and ideas. What this means is that many of the positions that developed in the past in relation to the religious other in very different contextual conditions must also be rethought in the light of our context today. This requires theologians to rethink early ideas about the religious other and to come up with more appropriate ideas for our own time. So what are the characteristics of our context today? Again, to summarize. We take for granted today, for example, certain values and ideas. The idea of common human dignity, shared by all, regardless of a person's ethnicity, religion, culture, race, language, or skin color. The idea that people should not be discriminated against because they are different. A strong sense of individual freedom, and that any obstacles to personal freedom should be removed. That human beings have rights as individuals. These are exemplified in various international conventions and treaties. For example, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood," and shall we say sisterhood also. As well as these values, increased mobility and technological development means that people are in closer contact with each other more than ever. Hundreds of millions of people move from one place to another for business or tourism or to escape wars or disaster. In the process, this creates very powerful forces, pushing people towards each other from different religious traditions and facilitating collaboration in workplaces, institutions, cities, towns, and countries. This level of interaction between people of different religious traditions is unprecedented in human history. This very different context forces us to re-evaluate our thinking about the religious other. It is no longer possible to hold on to views that isolate us or separate us from those who are different in belief. What this means is, in the modern period, a number of Muslim scholars and theologians are revisiting those ideas and views about the religious other that were developed and adopted during the early development of Islamic tradition. Needless to say that the exclusivist ideas Muslim theologians developed in the early periods of Islam still dominate Muslim thinking about the religious other, at least at a theological level. But at a more practical and pragmatic level, many Muslims have moved away from those exclusivist ideas to somewhat inclusivist ideas in their engagement with the religious other, and I think that's a very positive development. My main interest right now is in how Muslim thinkers and theologians are attempting at rethinking the early exclusivist ideas in today's context. While there are a number of frameworks, strategies, and approaches among Muslim theologians, I will mention just two key relevant issues. First, the identification of Quranic texts and teachings that support the inclusivist positions, which can become the foundations for inclusivism in Islam. Second, where possible, identification of strongly exclusivist texts in the Quran and in the tradition, and then interpretation of those texts using an appropriate model of interpretation. In doing so, these Muslim thinkers and scholars emphasize that the work they are doing is very much rooted in the tradition and connected to the scriptural sources, and therefore emphasize continuity with such ideas within the tradition, even while they are trying to rethink those very early ideas. So this idea of continuity with the tradition is a very important idea. It gives a certain degree of legitimacy to those ideas, but Muslim thinkers are actually rethinking those very ideas I've just mentioned. Let me explore these two issues briefly. Let us look at the foundations of inclusivism in the Quran first. First, the emphasis in the Quran on our shared human dignity. The Quran emphasizes that we all of us, came from the same mother and father, as Muslims would say. And this is emphasized in the Quran on a number of occasions. Let me me just quote the Quran again here. The Quran says, "We have honored the children of Adam and carried them on the land and sea. We provided for them good provisions, and we gave them greater advantages than many of our other creatures." Chapter 17, verse 70. Second, the Quran speaks of a universal way to God that was revealed to prophets. In the Quran, there is the concept of a universal way that has been emphasized by prophets, messengers, teachers, and guides throughout history. The Quran calls this universal way deen, an Arabic term. This is often translated as religion. But in the language of the Quran, it doesn't necessarily have to mean religion, simply the way. The Quran also teaches the idea that all prophets, teachers, and guides taught universal self-surrender or submission to God. The Quran calls this Islam, the small I. Of course, in Arabic, there is no small I or capital I. When we translate the Arabic word Islam, sometimes we use small I or capital I, mostly capital I, but I'm actually saying this is small I. The term Islam with a small I is understood by Muslim thinkers like Muhammad Asad, a contemporary interpreter of the Quran, to simply mean self-surrender to God. In this sense, the Quran refers to Abraham, Jesus, and Noah, for example, as Muslims with a small m, along with pretty much anyone else who surrendered to God. These days, we use the term Muslim with a capital M to refer to followers of Prophet Muhammad. But in the language of the Quran, the meaning of Muslim, shall we say with a small m, is broader and covers anyone who submitted to the one God. For instance, the Quran in chapter 2, verse 136 says, "Say, we believe in God and what was sent down to us, and in what was sent down to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the patriarchs, and in what was given to Moses and Jesus and all the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction among any of them. To him alone we are submitters." Third, the Quran makes it clear that diversity was God's deliberate choice. Different cultures, different legal systems, and religions were all part of God's plan for humankind. This means there is a purpose behind the differences that we have. We all look different, we speak differently, we follow different religious traditions, we live in different communities and have different experiences, but this is purposeful based on the Quran. God created us to be one human community, but also introduced very purposeful difference in terms of nations and tribes. He did this with the overall purpose for us, that is, to know one another. The Quran says, and I quote, "O humankind, we," meaning God, "have created you male and female, and made you into communities and tribes, so that you may know one another." God also provided different systems of religion and of organizing society. A very famous Quranic verse says in relation to this, "Each of you will be provided a direction towards which it faces. So raise to all that is good." The term direction or wijha in Arabic in this verse can be understood as a system of law. Muslims have a particular system, people of other faiths have their particular systems of law and ethical guidance. And there are many verses in the Quran which suggest that those who believe in God, the prophets, and judgment will attain salvation, regardless of their system of law. The Quran says in chapter 5, verse 48, "For each community, we," meaning God, "have been appointed from you a law and a way. Had God willed, he could have made you one community, but that he might try you by that which he has given you, he has made you as you are. So vie with one another in good works." That's where the competition lies. Fourthly, the Quran emphasizes good deeds, or good works, as well as correct belief for salvation. This means it is not enough to just believe in one God. One must translate this into good works or deeds. In many verses of the Quran, the Quran brings together belief and deeds or works. Simply having correct belief from a Quranic point of view is insufficient for the purpose of salvation. The Quran in chapter 2 verse 62 says, "Surely those who believe, those who are Jewish, the Christians and the converts, and anyone who believes in God and believes in the last day and leads a righteous life will receive their recompense from their Lord. They have nothing to fear, nor will they grieve." This is a kind of very general kind of acceptance of a difficult position. Muslim theologians, issue of salvation is important. For many of us, salvation is important. But when you look at some Quranic texts, it's amazing what the Quran says on these issues. Read them carefully. Fifth, the Quran instructs that other religious traditions, including their followers and scriptures, should not be denigrated. The Quran guides Muslims to engage in dialogue with people of the book, for example, in the best manner possible. People of the book are Jews and Christians, primarily, and Muslim scholars extended the concept of people of the book, or the idea of people of the book, to other religious traditions too in early Islamic history. The Quran says, "Invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction, and argue with them," meaning with the people of the book, "in the way that is best." Chapter 16, verse 185. The Muslims must not say bad things about other faiths, or even about those religious traditions the Quran does not accept as valid or acceptable, such as the polytheistic traditions of the Meccans in the early part of the 7th century. So this is a form of respect for other religious traditions, or at the very least an exhortation not to denigrate them. Sixth, the Quran emphasizes freedom of belief, that there is no coercion or compulsion in matters of faith. From the very beginning, Muslims have maintained the idea that there should not be any coercion in matters of faith, and this is widely accepted in Islamic theology and law. Faith is something that must come from within. A very famous Quranic verse says, "There is to be no coercion in matters of faith," chapter 2, verse 256. And in another Quranic verse it says, "To you is your path, religion, to me, mine." Many Quranic verses, without ambiguity, state that the question of faith and belief is a personal matter between an individual and God. Freedom of belief is an individual choice in the Quran, something that happens between an individual and God. The Quran is very clear that people have personal and individual autonomy in this matter. They have the ability to consider the options for themselves and to make a decision to believe or not to believe in God. Now that's really a summary of what you might call the foundations for inclusivism in the Quran. But let me just mention the second issue I referred to earlier on. The second issue is that Muslim scholars and theologians are actually identifying the exclusivist texts in the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet and Islamic tradition, and they are actually reinterpreting a lot of that. So it's about exclusivist text and their interpretation. In addition to those inclusivist texts I just mentioned, there are, of course, opposing texts in the Quran as well as with the tradition. But Muslim inclusivists argue that the exclusivist texts and ideas in the Quran, by and large, can be explained by understanding their historical context. Again, they're coming back to the idea of context. Although these texts often have been interpreted in a strongly exclusivist manner throughout the centuries, the inclusivists would argue that other interpretations are possible. One example is Quran chapter 3, verse 19, which says, "True religion with God is Islam." Again, the question is whether this is Islam with a capital I or with a small I. Chapter 3, verse 85 says, "Whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him or her." Another Quranic verse, in chapter 5, verse 3 says, Today I, meaning God, have perfected your religion and have chosen Islam to be your religion. Now this goes back to the point I made early on, that the term Islam in these verses and many others have often been interpreted by Muslim commentators on the Quran to refer to the religion that was propagated by Prophet Muhammad and followed by millions of Muslims today, that is Islam with a capital I. However, not all scholars, Muslim scholars, agree with this understanding. For instance, according to a contemporary scholar, Saeed when the Quran uses the term Islam, it is simply referring to the universal surrender to God. And this characterizes many religious traditions. So Abraham, for example, in Quran chapter 3, verse 67, is not described as a Muslim because he followed the Prophet Muhammad, but because he surrendered to God. This view makes it possible to understand such challenging verses in an entirely different way. Finally, on this issue, such interpretation of exclusivist texts should rely on a framework or a model of interpretation that takes into account the context of the time of the emergence of Islam in the early 7th century, in the context of our time. So these Muslim scholars would argue that yes, we have these very exclusivist texts, but in order to interpret them appropriately, we also have to take into account the model of interpretation that we are going to use. And these scholars would argue for a contextualist approach to interpreting the Quran. What I'm presenting here is a model of interpretation that I actually use in my own works, and I've developed this in a number of articles and books. But this is a kind of summary of this contextualist approach to interpreting the Quran. But other scholars may have different models, but the key idea is in interpreting the Quran, one has to take into account the context of the early 7th century and the context of the 21st century which we are living in right now, and also the contexts in which Muslim scholars and theologians interpreted these texts throughout history. So the idea of context is essential. And this is something that is very familiar to most of you, but within Islam also this debate is taking place. But despite development in contemporary Muslim inclusivist scholarship, there are a number of challenges when it comes to moving away from strongly exclusivist attitudes towards the religious other. I'm talking about in Islamic tradition. The first challenge is the weight of the Islamic theological and legal tradition that has, for the most part, looked at the religious other from a strongly exclusivist perspective because of the positions developed early on. The second challenge is the feeling among many Muslims that a strongly inclusivist view may dilute Islamic tradition and could eradicate distinctive aspects of Islam as a religion. If so, Islam may not be distinguishable from other religions. The third challenge is the view among Muslims that Islam, being a missionary religion, must maintain an exclusivist attitude towards other religious traditions to advance its missionary goals, much like other missionary religious traditions. It must offer a product in the marketplace for religion that is very black and white, and part of this is that it must maintain the salvation, or the idea of salvation, and the idea that salvation can be attained only through one path, that is the path of Islam. There are many other challenges too, but I thought these three challenges are very important in this context. So what is the way forward? First, in my view, as Muslims, we need to recognize the significant differences between the context in which we are living right now and that of the early Islamic or pre-modern periods. Second, we may have to go back to the theological positions about the religious other that were developed then and understand them in their proper context. Third, we must contextualize these theological positions for our time now and see whether they still make sense, given the changed social, political, and religious contexts. If they do not, then it is my view that they may have to be rethought. Fourth, such rethinking should be principled and based on an appropriate framework, and also in a way that does not destroy the most basic Islam. In this way, we can emphasize those inclusivist texts and ideas from the Quran, the Prophet's practice, and Islamic tradition, and can come up with a view of the religious other that is in line with the dominant values of our time. I talked about the context and values earlier on. Even if some significant exclusivist views remain in relation to other religious traditions, for example, on salvation, I believe we can still develop inclusivist positions and ideas about the religious other as a person. For me, this is one of the most urgent issues that many religious traditions, including Islam, faces today. How we do that within our religious traditions while remaining faithful to the basic tenets of each tradition is the key challenge all of us face today. Thank you.
Much, Professor, for presenting this very important paper, because it all has to do with how we treat each other. And I know that a prerequisite for effective interfaith dialogue is mutual respect, and to have an awareness of exclusivist, inclusivist views helps us understand the context for our interfaith dialogue and some of the views that people from different faiths will bring to those meetings and to our everyday interactions on campus and in the wider community. And the dynamics of this, of course, apply to relations between people of all different faiths, which is what we will explore in the workshop after morning tea for those who'd like to come. So we have around 5 or 7 minutes for questions, comments, before I hand over to Jay for housekeeping. Yes, Judy.
A comment. Professor, as you were talking, I could hear the same sorts of things are happening in my own tradition, Christianity, of looking at context, looking at how things are developed and how we grow. It was, I guess, encouraging to hear that we're doing the same kinds of things.
Thank you.
First, thank you very much indeed for laying this out, and I think anyone who is serious about dialogue and diversity and mutual coexistence must see this as the way forward. May I ask, please, I think in the Middle East this would not have caught on yet. In Australia, what proportion of Islamic communities would be thinking along these lines? I'm thinking of communities with their imams and so on. What proportion would be thinking along these lines rather than on the exclusivist lines? Thank you.
Thank you. It's very hard to give, the numbers and figures here, because what we're seeing is different pockets within the Muslim community actually taking all these ideas. Two things. I should make a clear distinction between two things. One is, at a theological level, there would still be quite a lot of Muslims who are very much within the pre-modern early kind of frameworks. And my sense is that's by and large how most Muslims in Australia would be thinking about these issues. But when it comes to the practical or the pragmatic side of the things, where we actually focus on the religious other as a person in day-to-day life and the like, this inclusivist attitude will be pretty much dominant, I would say. But as you can appreciate, some of the stuff that the ideas that are associated with this kind of discourse can be quite problematic and also quite confronting for a lot of Muslims, because some Muslims feel that you are asking fundamental questions about some of the deeply held beliefs about other religious traditions, salvation, and a lot of other things. But the position I take, and a number of other Muslim scholars take, is that by adopting a more inclusivist attitude towards other religious traditions and the religious other, we are not actually destroying the fundamentals of the religion, we are actually building on that. So the basic text for us is the Quran, which has plenty of material if one wants to actually look at the religious other and other religious traditions in a more inclusivist manner. So it's no figures at this stage.
A work in progress.
Yes, and I think it's important a range of views within Christianity as well, some of whom would be equally exclusivist. Have we got a question here?
Yeah, hello, I'm Jeremy from Sheffield, and I was thinking about the Middle East in a very different way to your question because of my own heritage, which is Baghdadi Jewish, partly, 1/4 Baghdadi Jewish. And I'm aware in the Middle East, in both Al-Quds in Jerusalem and in Baghdad and in Cairo, for centuries, there was a peace between the people of the book and a way of living alongside where there was some othering, but there was also some neighbouring as well. And I've been highly conscious of that, and I know that the people in Baghdad together supported the struggle for Palestinian freedom in the 1930s, and together as Christians, Jews and Muslims were putting money into that struggle for Palestinian liberation. What I noticed though, when I travelled in a very different part of the world, I'm going to take us to 2 more places, to Northern Ireland, where still education happens along grounds where people are therefore othered because there are Protestant and there are Catholic schools, and that's the predominant way of education. I was surprised, and therefore I've always been distressed where I see that separating out. From my Muslim sisters and brothers, I have always been included in a very inclusivist way, except on one occasion, and I will say when that occasion was. It was after George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech in 2002, and on one of my many visits to Al-Quds in Palestine, to Jordan and to Israel. And so many people welcomed me there again and again, but then one person said to me at the separation wall, he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I am from Britain," and he said, "Go away, you are not welcome here." And I said, "I come in peace." And he said, "But you are with Tony Blair." I said, "I didn't vote for Tony Blair." He said, but you are still with him because he and you are of that country. Go away, you are not welcome here. And he was a man in his 70s carrying a heavy load, and I felt the most profound respect for that othering of me, and I thought that that was quite reasonable, because where our religions and our cultures interconnect, like they did in Baghdad and Cairo, or where they disconnect, like we have in the post-British mandated environment of Al-Quds, well, fair enough.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess it again highlights the issue of political context in which we function. It's not so much the religious differences, but it's actually the political, economic and other similar issues that are often used to other the other things.
Question up here?
Can I just ask, in adopting an inclusivist position, is that in reality an acceptance by members of Muslim faith such as myself of a plurality, plural society such as is happening in Australia and in other parts of the Western world?
You mean at a social level?
At a social level, at a, you know, currently we're looking at Islam as a sort of a bogey and is used or abused, whichever way you want to interpret it, by many Western governments and so forth, and as an alarmist, etc., etc. And of course, some of it creates, it exacerbates division, and that's where I think the issue that most Western societies are supposedly pluralist.
I would say by and large most Muslims in Australia would be also pluralist in that sense. If you look at the history of Islam, look at 1400 years of Islamic history, and look at any Muslim majority country in the world today, until recently or now, pretty much all Muslim dominated societies, I guess, would have people of other faiths, and that has always been part of Islamic tradition. In talking about Baghdad or Spain or Cairo or Damascus, in the 20th century, political issues, I would say that should not be used as a basis to look at how Islamic tradition looked at the other. I mean, places like Baghdad, look at 9th century would say by and large that's how, generally speaking, Muslims would look at the other, whether it's political other or religious other or whatever in Australia. The theological issues, a lot of Muslims are still struggling with those issues. I'm sure within Christianity there are all kinds of theological debates about how you reconceptualize the other. Just look at the Vatican II, for instance, the Catholic tradition, which is a major change. This is a huge change within the tradition that has maintained a whole range of views about Jews and Muslims and so forth. So we are looking at those changes pretty much in all religious traditions. Religious traditions by their nature are very diverse. Islam is very diverse, Christianity is very, very diverse. We have within each tradition so many different voices. And I would say we are the product of our time. And our ideas about religion, about theology, about religion, they are also product of our times. And we are seeing significant transformations in the thinking of many scholars in many different religious traditions on this issue.
Thank you. One last quick question up the back. Sorry, yes. Yes? No, that's you. Please, could you stand and speak up? So we should have a microphone. I don't know that we do have a microphone, but speak loudly so we can all hear the question.
It's more of a comment, just from the Christian perspective, the American Christian perspective, this history of how we reinterpret Scripture goes way back to the sound. I mean, fundamentalism was a Christian term born out of this group of people saying these are the fundamentals, and unless you abide by these, you're, apostate. And so, I think part of the wonder of the work we get to do and being in these conversations and relationships with each other is realizing not just the places in our holy texts that make space for the other, but the fact that in this human condition of trying to negotiate claims of allegiance to this amazing God, that many of us traverse the same path in our own ways, if that makes any sense. And really quickly, a really quick anecdote from my context, which is MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, teaching Mass USA. Some of the interfaith work and panels and discussions that our chaplains has been able to do have involved where we come clean, and the prior imam and the Catholic priest both very honestly said, yes, the reality is in my church's teachings, this is the way to salvation. And it was a wonderful conversation because it made for more real love and siblinghood by knowing this about each other rather than pretending that it wasn't the case.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, the thing is that in these discussions we shouldn't be trying to eradicate the differences in our religious traditions and there's no point in actually saying, oh, we're compromising on our basics. There's no need for that. I don't argue for that. We have to maintain our differences. At the same time, we have to find ways of relation to the other. The relation to the other doesn't necessarily involve that we actually eradicate all the differences in basic beliefs and the like, whether it's salvation or anything else. We can maintain all those differences. We can have a very exclusivist view in relation to these issues, but we can have a very strongly inclusivist view as far as the other is concerned.
Ask you just to move. Thank you so much, Professor Saeed, for sharing with us this very important keynote address. And I am privileged to know you as a colleague and a friend, and I think over many years we build up relationships which enable future educational events of this nature to happen. So may this event be a springboard for future events, and I would really encourage you to make use of this wonderful man, you Australians who are here, to invite Professor Saeed to speak in your areas and to draw on his expertise, because it's so important to get a clear articulation of how we, as people of other faiths, are perceived by the religious other. So this message was a blessing to me 9 years ago, and it has transformed the way I have seen people of other faiths. And I hope there's been something of that for you today, to hear such an intelligent and heartfelt message from the heart as well as from the head. So on behalf of us all, I'd like to present you with a small gift, and thank you both so much for coming. housekeeping notices before we move to morning tea.